Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Gary Gamblin. Gary, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here this morning.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with you. I've been really knee-deep in diving into a lot of the vulnerability management landscape and research and things like that as part of a book I recently wrote. And I came across several of your posts and your thoughts on the topic, and I was like, I need to talk to this guy. So for folks that don't know you, though, or haven't read anything you've wrote or talked about, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah. I spent the first 10 years of my career working for the government, getting kind of a really in-depth view of vulnerability management. I then spent 5 years at Carfax, a huge data company, kind of opened me up to the corporate world. From there, I moved on to a startup called Kenna Security, who helps people understand risk. We were acquired by Cisco almost 2 years ago, and that's where I serve as director of research now for their threat detection and response team.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've come across you several times. I actually was reading a book, a very deep data-centric book about vulnerability management recently, and you were cited in there in the acknowledgments as someone that they couldn't have essentially done the book without. So that was really cool. So I want to lead us off. First off, I've seen you talk a lot lately about CVSS, and obviously we know CVSS 4.0 is coming out. For folks that don't know, maybe a little primer on what CVSS is, and then what do we expect to come with CVSS 4.0? What are your thoughts on it so far?
Oh, that's a big question. CVSS is just the common vulnerability scoring standard. It's just a way to base score a CVE. What a lot of people don't understand is outside of the base score, there are other vectors that companies and individuals are supposed to add to make that vulnerability score make sense in their environment. But a lot of people just look at the base score and just take it from there and set that as the goal. And security companies and people are responsible for that because we often just paste the base score on our websites or in our emails and don't do any work beyond that. CVSS 4 is, as it implies, the fourth version of CVSS. It just went into public an information gathering stage where they put out the information, talked about what's going to be in there. You can find that information at first.org. It's great to read and to kind of dig in. And I've been doing that some this past couple of weeks, and I think you have too, and starting to see a lot more chatter around CVSS 4 and how it's going to be able to kind of help the security industry overall.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned was how we kind of misuse it in terms of using the base score most of the time. And I think even CVSS themselves, kind of recommends against that practice, but we still seem to do that overwhelmingly. I'm curious from your perspective. I've worked in a lot of, you talked about 10 years in the government. In the government, they tend to just leverage CVSS and drive, vulnerability remediation timelines and requirements around severity scores, for example. Why do you think we typically just use the base score? Is it because, doing the, environmental, temporal, et cetera, stuff takes such, rigor and context and cognitive energy and, there's just so many vulnerabilities, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. I mean, people aren't good at judging their own risk. So when you add in those environmental and temporal scores, if you get it wrong, you could miss something. And the other thing is everybody needs a number that's the same across the board so that they can judge. The problem is that the average CVSS score today, base score for 3 is 7.2, right? So I talk to people about that all the time. It's like, if you are doing PCI or whatever, it says you got to patch high and critical. That means right off the bat, you're going to have to patch half of every CVEs that come out just because everything that comes out is basically a high or critical.
Yeah, simply it's just too much for any organization to do, and we have limited. We hear all the time about the cybersecurity workforce shortage, and then we hear about needing to empower developers to move fast. And if you have to patch half of every damn vulnerability you see, it's going to be hard to move fast. So I wanted to ask you too, like CVSS 4.0, it brings in, if I'm not mistaken, exploitability vector. And there's been a lot of talk about, EPSS and SysACAV around exploitation or exploitation probability. How do you think this exploitability vector fits into, say EPSS being in the mix now and things like that?
Yeah, Chris, you're going to give me a little bit of trouble here. I'm not a fan of the exploitability vector the way they have it built in CVSS 4.0. Right now, the way it's built is it's always said is not defined on the regular base score. You can only lower the CVSS score with that vector today. So I personally am asking people to stay away from it, because you can only, if you go to undefined, it'll lower the score. And that doesn't make sense because we know that we need people to look at the CVE and say, okay, hey, we know this is being exploited. We want to give this a bump to make it make it more actionable for our customers or for our sysadmins to do. I'm just not super excited about that vector. I really wish it was assume something isn't being exploited and then move it up the rank instead of the CVE method of assume the worst and let people walk it down the risk scale. That just doesn't work for exploitability today.
Yeah, I think assuming the worst, obviously on one hand, I can see why that would be intuitive, but it expands the scope of, how much we need to address because we're assuming the worst in all cases and exploitability in all cases, So I appreciate your transparency there about how you feel about it. I agree with you. One thing I want to ask you too is I recently had someone on from the organization known as Versillion, and they had published a study with Ponemon Institute, I think it was, and they found that, in the study they did, the average organization had a backlog of over 100,000 open unremediated vulnerabilities. So I started to ask myself, is this like an intractable problem? Do you see? I know we'll never get to zero, but it seems like essentially organizations are simply struggling to keep pace with the emerging vulnerabilities and their ability to remediate them.
So I talked to a lot of companies and a lot of people about this, and vulnerabilities is like credit card debt, right? People are good about paying off their bill today, but they just add a little bit every month. They add, 5 vulnerabilities they can't get to every month, and they keep those 5 vulnerabilities forever. And so you get to the point where we know through our work with Scientia that the average company can only patch about 12% of the vulnerabilities on their network a month, no matter what size they are. The issue isn't as terrible as people think because Windows and Mac and everything are automatic updates now. So you're really seeing a drop in there. What it is it's their back office systems and the Adobes and stuff that aren't automatic that they're not getting to. And it gets so old, it makes people afraid to patch. Because, I could go and patch this version of Java, but I don't have a great testing mechanism to test this. And, if it breaks payroll, I'm in trouble. So let's just leave that on there. While I know there are vulnerabilities on there, I would much rather the company still operate than to patch that vulnerability. So it really gets into a kind of a compound debt thing, and you end up in a situation where you can't replace stuff because you're just scared of what might break.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know that's been a longstanding challenge of, afraid to disrupt the business or call it operational disruption or things that can impact revenue, for example. And then another side note, when I was writing the book about software supply chain, we have this new nuanced situation where maybe the update or the patch itself could be poisonous, which is an interesting kind of, another great thing for us to worry about here in cyber. Yeah. I wanted to ask you too, you talked recently about, how there were 7,000 vulnerabilities released in 2023, I think it was to date, and that there's 77 CVEs per day.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on organizations focusing on maybe mitigating controls or compensating controls versus just trying to, patch everything, for example?
Yeah, I think there are 2 ways to go. I am a big fan if people can do it of building a mutable infrastructure, but unless you're a startup, you're not at that point where you can just say, okay, we're going to rebuild every server we have every morning with the latest patches. From there, you got to take a step back and say, okay, what can we do to protect? What can we do to protect our environment the best? What do we have in our environment? What makes us the most money? What is the most critical if it goes down? And that's what I'm going to spend my time and my cycles protecting first. And then move out and protect stuff that's secondary and tertiary as we go along.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've seen, at least in the federal space, there's been a lot of dialogue from leaders at CISA and other organizations trying to advocate for secure by design, secure by default. But as I point out in the blog recently, like that concept goes back to, all the way to the Ware report, like 50 plus years ago. But, the exponential growth of CVEs continues to occur in the NVD, for example. Do you think we'll ever see that direction change, or is it just kind of the nature of more software, more applications, more vulnerabilities?
there's a couple of points. There are more vulnerabilities because of companies like GitHub and other companies making publishing a CVE easier. And people ask me all this time is, does more CVEs mean the software is less secure? The answer is no. It just means the reporting mechanisms are getting better and better. If you tell someone there were, 24,000 or 22,000 CVEs in 2022, that might sound like a lot, but when you get into a world where you're talking about big data, 80 records a day is super tiny, right? Companies can handle that if they are prepared to strip those records down and know what they're looking for and say, hey, I don't have to worry about Bluetooth skateboards and crock pots, right? Those aren't on my network. So every time I see that CPE come up, I can just ignore those. And then you're back down to a manageable 4 or 5 CVEs a day that your organization has to worry about.
Yeah, I think one thing you said that's worth emphasizing is the lack of CVEs or vulnerabilities doesn't necessarily mean that something's more secure. Maybe the reporting mechanism isn't as good, or maybe people just aren't looking. So sometimes there's a false sense of security with a product having no CVEs. Maybe they just haven't looked, or no one's reported it, or whatever the case is. So that's something to keep in mind too. One thing I wanted to ask you next is, you've been in this vulnerability management space for quite a while. You have a lot of deep expertise. We've seen a lot of interest lately around software supply chain security, the growing use of open source software, but also a push to have better visibility of components and libraries and, things like that, SBOMs to provide that visibility. What's your thought about the broader, kind of software supply chain security discussion that's going on right now as it relates to vulnerability management?
I think that it's a sleeping dragon that people are finally starting to look at. If you believe the numbers, that 95% of an application is third-party code, that's a ton of code. Companies have trouble now auditing and taking care of the 5% of the code that they write internally and making sure that's secure. When you go from there and say, okay, you are now responsible for checking and securing every third-party library that you bring in and every third-party library that library brings in, it gets to a point where it's untenable and it just becomes a checkmark exercise at that point. I write in Python mostly these days, and I know that every time I do an import, I'm adding a million lines of code to something that I'm writing, and I can't go and audit that, right? So somebody said, hey, can you tell me if this is all secure? Like, I have a hard time telling you the 100 lines of code I just wrote are secure, let alone, the pandas library I just brought in with a million lines is secure. So I think people are in for a rude awakening, and very few people understand what they are asking for when they say, hey, can you tell me if your supply chain is secure all the way back to your third-party libraries?
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult problem, and perhaps one that no one can fully say 100% certain in all cases. I wanted to ask you on that same note, as someone who's been around the vulnerability management space for a long time, you have a lot of depth of expertise in like NVD, for example. But we have seen other vulnerability databases start to come out from Sonatype or OSV or the Global Security Database, kind of effort underneath Cloud Security Alliance, for example. How do you think NVD plays in this open source software ecosystem around vulnerabilities, or is there a need for these other diverse databases?
No, NVD is always going to be the source of truth. I talk to people all the time about it. It's the Rosetta Stone for security practitioners. Everybody knows what a CVE is. If you go and you look at those Sonatype or those SNCC or whoever's database, they normally always pivot off of the CVE as the thing. So CVEs are going to be around for a long time because it's our common language and everybody speaks it. I think that all these other databases are nice and they're adding on, and it'll be interesting to see where they go. But I don't see NVD losing dominance in the next 10 or 15 years.
Makes sense. Yeah, one thing I want to ask you too is we talked about like the technical aspects of vulnerability databases and CVEs and things like that. What are your thoughts around the human element of this? We've seen the push for DevSecOps and breaking down silos, between developers and security. But a lot of times in my practical experience, when you provide these lengthy vulnerability reports to your developer peers, it doesn't build a lot of great friendships in many cases, and it often can be seen as slowing the business down, being a burden, things like that. What do you think about the human element of vulnerability management?
Yeah, I think that you have to be able to talk about risk in a way that makes sense. in a not totally politically correct way, we used to have a saying called, POC or GTFO. That means if you're going to go in and break a sprint, you better be able to bring a proof of concept, right? That says, hey, if this person sends this string or does this or SSH is in his box, this bad thing can happen, right? And it show people. And then if you're in a room and you show a developer that their software is broke and can be hacked, 95% of the time they get that light bulb moment and they're like, okay, I'm going to fix that, right? What you're talking about, long reports and whatever, nobody likes that, right? When was the last time you got a 100-page PDF that you were excited to dig through, right? Nobody likes that. I don't like it if my accountant sends me a 100-page PDF of stuff to look through a contract, right? I'm like, I thought I was paying you to do all of this stuff. Why can't you make this actionable for me? And I think that for some reason, security people forget that their job is to make security actionable for the teams that they bring data to. And that's where most of the friction lies that I've seen.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think that's why we're seeing the push for, some of these sources like SysAkev. Is it known to be exploited? Or exploit prediction scoring system? Is it probable to be exploited? Because if we just throw a severity score at them and there's no proof of an exploit or even proof that it's likely to be exploited, it's just wasting time, energy, and resources for the business and not really driving value. What are your thoughts around, SysAkev and then EPSS, since I opened those can of worms?
Yeah, I love EPSS. I'm on the special interest group for them, and I help. EPSS actually came out of our startup out of Kenna. It uses our patented scoring system. So that was one of the very first things that we spun out. So we're always a big fan of EPSS. It's great. It looks 30 days ahead. And if you use it for what it was designed for, is, hey, what's the likelihood of this CVE getting an exploit in the next 30 days? That's great. Of course, it'll tell you it's not a full risk vulnerability, right? It doesn't tell you when stuff has been exploited and when it hasn't. To take your other point, the SysAkev, I like SysAkev too. I like what they're doing. I think that it's super important to realize that that's a federal database for federal organizations. So a lot of those CVEs that end up on there are directed directly towards federal agencies. And they have to be local attacks. And if you're a federal agency and you're the CIA or NSA or Department of Homeland Security, maybe people are breaking into your building and doing chip level attacks on like your Snapdragon CPUs, which is one of the KEF. But most people don't need to deal with those, right? They need to deal with their networking vulnerabilities first. So I always tell people, if you're going to use SysAkev as kind of a guideline, the thing that you should do is just enhance that database just a little bit and remove everything that's local and start with the network vulnerabilities first. And that's a much better way for you to spend your time.
Yeah, I really like that emphasis. It is definitely federally centric. And then, as you point out, remote accessibility should be a key driving factor, especially in today's distributed environment. It's unlikely someone's physically trying to compromise your system in most cases. On EPSS, definitely recommend folks check that out. I was digging into the 3.0 white paper recently, and you have some fascinating graphics that show the improvement of say EPSS 1 to 2 to 3, and then also contrast it with things like KEV and other approaches in terms of covering exploited vulnerabilities and what actually gets prioritized for remediation. So definitely, folks, check that out. I wanted to ask, before we leave, one question we always ask everyone is, what does the term cyber resiliency mean to you?
Resiliency just means the ability to bounce back after an incident, right? No one is going to be perfect. No basketball game ends 137-0. No football game normally ends, 21-0. The defense is going to score at some time, right? You're going to be scored on at some point. It's how you can go from there and set back up your defense and make sure that it doesn't happen too much, right? Because it's all you're trying to do is just slow down the other side. What can I do today to make my defense better? And that's kind of what I tell people, right? It's like, can we get 1% better today? If you get 1% better today, by the end of the year, you're 300% better, right? Like it's just incremental. And yeah, people are in bad spots with vulnerability management, but if you can just start working on something, you can just start working like, okay, I want to make sure there's nothing on the SysAkev list on my network. that's much better than where you were if you're just kind of playing whack-a-mole and just guessing at what you should patch.
Yeah, on that note, a couple things. The paper I think I read, it might have been the EPSS paper, but maybe not. But it talked about how using the CVSS approach is kind of akin to just randomly choosing vulnerabilities to remediate, which doesn't seem logical. And then other thing, I think you brought it full circle when you talked about that 1% better incremental improvement from a vulnerability management perspective around resiliency, because you also talked about how it's kind of compound interest. People progressively drowned among the vulnerabilities as they just kind of accrue them over time and don't really buy that tech debt down, basically the vulnerability debt down. So I wanted to ask, from you, what else are you working on? Where can folks find you? If folks want to connect with you and chat, what's the best way?
I'll be out at Hacker Summer Camp like most people. So I'll be at B-Sides, Las Vegas, giving a talk on EPSS, and I have some stuff in the works for DEF CON. So follow me on Twitter at Jake Gamblin, and hit me up on LinkedIn. I love to talk. I love to chat vulnerability management. It's my day job, but it's also a passion. So anytime you guys want to chat, just let me know.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, and thanks folks for tuning in. That'll take us out for today.
Thank you.